Gerald Ford was right. Normalizing the prosecution of political opponents is dangerous as America finds itself trapped in a vicious cycle. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about not just the indictments of former President Donald Trump. We're up to 4 now, the latest out of Fulton County, Georgia. Because Donald Trump was challenging the election results in 2020, as is guaranteed under the First Amendment right to freedom of speech and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But the same thing's happening at the federal level by special counsel Jack Smith, who has similarly brought charges against former President Trump for challenging the election and what he says is a false manner. Fulton County, Georgia is making similar allegations saying, oh, these were false allegations or false, kind of proclamations about the integrity of elections. And I say erroneous or not, that's political speech. He was petitioning the government. He was, filing court briefs. He was petitioning state legislatures and legislators. They had alternate slates of delegates that they were putting forward, et cetera, things that have happened before. In 1960, there were alternate slates of electors. In 1876, there were alternate slates of electors that preceded the 1887 Electoral Count Act, which established a process under which you could have, if there were alternate sets of electors going to Congress when the Congress is to certify the Electoral College, they would have a means of adjudicating that. And in that case, it put the onus on the states to certify the electors and then on Congress to hear any potential challenges. And that's exactly what happened on January 6, 2021. But that hasn't stopped Fulton County, Georgia, nor special counsel Jack Smith from levying these charges. That's 2 of the trials. The third trial is in Miami, Florida, where former President Trump is being charged and will be tried for retaining and receiving classified documents while he was president and then retaining them when he left office. And Trump says he declassified those. That's 3. And then there's 4, a campaign finance supposed violation by former President Trump, this time in New York City with the DA's office there. So these are all kind of Democrat controlled district attorney's offices and special counsels. Special counsel answers to Merrick Garland. He was appointed by Joe Biden. He's a Democrat. So you have the one party that's in power prosecuting their political opponents who are out of power. This is what tin pot dictators do. This is what failing republics do. And I hate to think that we've become a failing republic, but I thought it would also be a good idea to then kind of point at the impeachments, the impeachment inquiry. Trump was impeached twice. And now Republicans, they're firing up their own impeachment inquiry of Joe Biden for he and his son's foreign business dealings while Biden was vice president. And I have to ask the question, if it wasn't for Russiagate and, the false allegations that Trump was a Russian agent, the special counsel investigation, the 2 impeachments that were brought against Trump ultimately, would Republicans be pursuing an impeachment inquiry right now? And I'm not certain that the answer is yes. I think that we are, in fact, in a vicious cycle. But I wanted to point to the example of Gerald Ford. He pardoned Richard Nixon in 1974. And this was a very controversial decision. I wanted to first start with Nixon leaving office. Here he is. This is on August 9th, 1974. Richard Nixon has just resigned the presidency. Gerald Ford is going to be sworn into office. And again, this was a very controversial decision. There were people who wanted to prosecute Nixon after he was to leave office. He was about to be impeached. And so that, I think, kind of advised his decision to resign. And then it was up to Gerald Ford to decide, am I going to issue a pardon here? Or will this put us into a vicious cycle? And he actually kind of speaks to that in this speech. We're going to play Gerald Ford's speech for the Nixon pardon, because I think it has some sage advice and it warns about this cycle that I think we're kind of engaged in right now that has, frankly, brought down republics. This is what the framers were afraid of. when they were, they didn't want to establish a direct democracy in the style of ancient Greece. They had a practice called ostracism, where you could vote people out of the city, for exile them for a period of 10 years. You could just, any citizen could be exiled. And if someone put your name into the ballot, then the entire city had the vote on whether you were allowed to remain an Athenian for the next 10 years or not. And so that type of practice, but in Rome, it wasn't much better, where you had two consuls. And then eventually they ended up competing for power with one another, led to the Roman civil wars, which led to the fall of the Republic, the rise of Caesar, and then his assassination, more civil wars, and then the rise of the emperors after Octavian defeated Octavian and Mark Antony defeat Brutus, and then Mark Antony and Octavian end up fighting it out. Octavian defeats Mark Antony, and then he crowns himself emperor as the first emperor of Rome, Augustus. And so you can when you have the parties or the partisans in a country, in a republic, fighting against one another, the mischiefs of faction, which is what James Madison warned about in Federalist Number 10, can kind of ensue, and you can lose everything. You can lose your constitution. You can lose, democracy in general. Here's the opposite example of that, in my view. You have a peaceful transition of power here as Richard Nixon is leaving office.
There is the man who will be president in another couple of hours, Gerald Ford and his wife, Betty Ford.
Vice President Ford this morning, as he to come here for this occasion, said it was indeed one of the saddest incidents that he's ever seen. There's the president waving goodbye. You hear the applause.
So that's Richard Nixon leaving office. And I wanted you to see that. And then we're going to proceed with Gerald Ford's statement about this a month later. This is on August 9th, 1974. And then by September 8th, 1974, Gerald Ford is issuing a general pardon for Richard Nixon. And then we also have a speech here, but I wanted you to hear it yourself. This is TV.
I have learned already in this office that the difficult decisions always come to this desk. I must admit that many of them do not look at all the same as the hypothetical questions that I have answered freely and perhaps too fast on previous occasions. My customary policy is to try and get all the facts and to consider the opinions of my countrymen and to take counsel with my most valued friends. But these seldom agree, and in the end, the decision is mine. To procrastinate, to agonize, and to wait for a more favorable turn of events that may never come, or more compelling external pressures that may as well be wrong as right, is itself a decision of sorts and a weak and potentially dangerous course for a president to follow. I have promised to uphold the Constitution, to do what is right as God gives me to see the right, and to do the very best that I can for America. I have asked your help and your prayers, not only when I became president, but many times since. The Constitution is the supreme law of our land, and it governs our actions as citizens. Only the laws of God, which govern our consciences, are superior to it. As we are a nation under God, so I am sworn to uphold our laws with the help of God. And I have sought such guidance and searched my own conscience with special diligence to determine the right thing for me to do with respect to my predecessor in this place, Richard Nixon, and his loyal wife and family. Theirs is an American tragedy in which we all have played a part. It could go on and on and on, or someone must write the end to it. I have concluded that only I can do that, and if I can, I must. There are no historic or legal precedents to which I can turn in this matter, none that precisely fit the circumstances of a private citizen who has resigned the presidency of the United States. But it is common knowledge that serious allegations and accusations hang like a sword over our former president's head, threatening his health as he tries to reshape his life, a great part of which was spent in the service of this country and by the mandate of its people. After years of bitter controversy and divisive national debate, I have been advised, and I am compelled to conclude, that many months and perhaps more years will have to pass before Richard Nixon could obtain a fair trial by jury in any jurisdiction of the United States under governing decisions of the Supreme Court. I deeply believe in equal justice for all Americans, whatever their station or former station. The law, whether human or divine, is no respecter of persons, but the law is a respecter of reality. The facts, as I see them, are that a former president of the United States, instead of enjoying equal treatment with any other citizen accused of violating the law, would be cruelly and excessively penalized either in preserving the presumption of his innocence or in obtaining a speedy determination of his guilt in order to repay a legal debt to society. During this long period of delay and potential litigation, ugly passions would again be aroused, and our people would again be polarized in their opinions. And the credibility of our free institutions of government would again be challenged at home and abroad. In the end, the courts might well hold that Richard Nixon had been denied due process, and the verdict of history would even more be inconclusive with respect to those charges arising out of the period of his presidency of which I am presently aware. But it is not the ultimate fate of Richard Nixon that most concerns me, though surely it deeply troubles every decent and every compassionate person. My concern is the immediate future of this great country. In this, I dare not depend upon my personal sympathy as a longtime friend of the former president, nor my professional judgment as a lawyer, and I do not. As president, my primary concern must always be the greatest good of all the people of the United States, whose servant I am. As a man, my first consideration is to be true to my own convictions and my own conscience. My conscience tells me clearly and certainly that I cannot prolong the bad dreams that continue to reopen a chapter that is closed. My conscience tells me that only I, as president, have the constitutional power to firmly shut and seal this book. My conscience tells me it is my duty not merely to proclaim domestic tranquility, but to use every means that I have to ensure it. I do believe that the buck stops here, that I cannot rely upon public opinion polls to tell me what is right. I do believe that right makes might, and that if I am wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference. I do believe with all my heart and mind and spirit that I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy. Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we as a great and good nation can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
And starting today on our
And so that was Gerald Ford speaking on the Nixon pardon. I find that very interesting and a very, telling moment in American history, where he has the power to, kind of give a full pardon to the former president. He thinks it would not merely be good for Richard Nixon and what his family might go through, but he also believed that a former president could not possibly get a fair trial in the United States of America because the country's too polarized. You have too much partisanship. You're going to have, in the case of the Washington, D.C. case against Donald Trump, the January 6th and the election challenges trial, that's going to be, largely, manned by Democrats on the jury there. It's like 90-10 Democrat to Republican in Washington, D.C. You'd think Donald Trump's going to get a fair trial there. Even in Miami, it's about, I think, it's kind of 55, 45, 60, 40 Democrat to Republican. When you look at a presidential turnout in the elections, Democrats tend to win Miami. And so that's a situation, Ron DeSantis wins it, I think, or gets very close to winning it in the in a midterm cycle when he's running for re-election in 2022, and he does very well. He wins by a super majority there. But you also had elevated Republican turnout. I'm talking about in not in an off-year election, but in a presidential turnout year. In a city like Miami, Democrats are going to be heavily dominating the jury pool. So could Donald Trump get a fair trial in Miami? I'm not certain. And that's the classified documents case. New York City, again, that's like 80-20 Democrat to Republican. You think Donald Trump can get a fair trial there? Fulton County, Georgia, again, what's that, like 70-30 Democrat to Republican? You think Donald Trump's going to get a fair trial there? And on it goes. I think that this is exactly what Gerald Ford was talking about when it came to the Nixon pardon. And he considered how many months, how many years are we going to put the country through this cycle? And he speaks, I think, very Eloquently, as eloquent as Gerald Ford could be, but I think this is a good speech. And I actually wrote about it. Was this August 8th? Gerald Ford was right. Normalizing prosecution of political opponents is dangerous. And I say we're in a vicious cycle here. And what prompted me to write this was actually a piece from Foreign Policy magazine. I subscribed to their newsletter, and this was sent to me, and I was like, it's a pretty startling headline. It says, it's actually common to indict leaders of democracy. Trump is just one of 78 political leaders in democratic nations who have faced criminal charges since the year 2000. This is by Ashley Ahn and Brawley Benson. We'll read from parts of this here. Just the headline of a piece, Foreign Policies, Ashley Ahn and Brawley Benson on July 18th. Outlining a sort of categorical imperative for democracies to prosecute their former leaders in a bid to preserve the rule of law, oftentimes when the prosecuting force is from the opposing party. The context, of course, are 3 indictments now leveled at former President Trump. Now there's 4 indictments. We've gone through those. And in it, Ahn and Brawley argue, quote, the indictment and conviction of former leaders in democratic and semi-democratic countries around the world is in fact quite common, citing 48 heads of states convicted in 32 countries, including a larger subset of 78 leaders indicted in 53 countries. Now here they're talking about democracies. I think that, more precisely, I think we're a democratic, kind of a constitutional democratic republic. But in any event, they say it's normal to throw your opponents in jail in a democracy, but not in the United States, arguably the world's longest running democracy. And we know that because in 2020 in Foreign Policy magazine, Paul Musgrave, he's an assistant professor when he wrote this of political science at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, complained in Foreign Policy about the fact that we don't prosecute presidents. And he says that, but we need to. America needs to prosecute its presidents. Pardoning Trump like Nixon before him would be a disaster. So this was questioning whether Joe Biden, if he won the election, would pardon Donald Trump, and kind of arguing against that, saying, no, prosecute him, because that'll be good for the country. And he makes a lot of arguments that I address in this piece. In it, Musgrave notes the examples of former presidents John Tyler and Richard Nixon, who were never prosecuted or disgraced after leaving office. In Tyler's case, for participating in the Confederacy, he died before the end of the war. So the only thing you could have done after that was disgrace him. And for Nixon, over the break-in of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. in 1972, and his alleged role in covering it up and obstructing Congress's investigation of the scandal. Musgrave argued in his 2020 Foreign Policy piece, wrongly as it turned out, that, quote, an investigation of the Trump administration is unlikely to be politicized in any meaningful sense. Yeah, right. It's been highly politicized. Not only was Biden calling for, the prosecution of Trump, as have other Democratic district attorneys who are now acting upon that. Trump continues to lead all national polls for the Republican Party's presidential nomination in 2024 by a lot, and remains very competitive against Joe Biden in a head-to-head matchup. In polls that you see, Trump leads a lot of these polls. Democrats use the indictments to attack Trump. Republicans use it to defend Trump. So it's being politicized. So count one, Musgrave is wrong. It's being politicized in a very meaningful sense. Now, in Nixon's case, upon resigning the presidency, Ford promptly pardoned him in September of 1974. We just played the Ford speech of him issuing the pardon. You can rewind if you're catching this on replay and you want to go back and watch that part of it. When he did so, Ford warned of a vicious cycle that would ensue if Nixon were prosecuted after leaving office, calling it, quote, an American tragedy in which we all have played a part. It could go on and on and on, or someone must write an end to it. I have concluded that only I can do that, and if I can, I must. He also argued it was not possible for a former president to get a fair trial, one way or another, stating, quote, a former president of the United States, instead of enjoying equal treatment with any other citizen accused of violating the law, would be cruelly and excessively penalized, either in preserving the presumption of his innocence or in obtaining a speedy determination of his guilt in order to repay a legal debt to society. So I say, in the case of Trump, it is easy to see how this is already taking shape. You have Special Counsel Smith. He's looking to expedite trials against Trump and move jurisdiction to Washington, D.C. I think he wants to bring the Miami case up to Washington as well, where jury pools will be heavily, even more Democratic than they would be in Miami, tying them up in the 2024 presidential campaign that Trump is running in. Trump's running for president, and Democrats are trying to throw him in jail and disqualify him in some way. Although there are no charges, we would note, of insurrection against Trump. So the qualifications to be president under Constitution are you have to be 35 years old, you have to be a natural born citizen, and then a disqualification would be under the 14th Amendment, Section 3 and Section 5. If you were participating in a rebellion or insurrection and you were convicted of that, and then the House and Senate basically passed a bill disqualifying you from running for public office. This was done after the Civil War to disqualify anyone who had participated in the Confederacy from serving in public office. It was a penalty. It's also a constitutional amendment, so it's the supreme law of the land. But Jack Smith is not bringing insurrection charges. New York City DA Alvin Bragg, he's not bringing insurrection charges. And Fulton County, Georgia, they're not bringing any insurrection charges either. So Donald Trump, even if he's convicted of everything that he's on trial for, he'll still be standing for election, whether he's in prison or whether he's on trial. And I don't think it's going to hurt him one bit in the polls, because so far it hasn't at all. I think, Democrats are hoping it will hurt him. Otherwise, why campaign on that? Why politicize it? Why say, if I am elected district attorney, I will lock up Donald Trump, or President Biden saying, I will have Trump prosecuted, et cetera, et cetera. Ford added, quote, during this long period of delay and potential litigation, ugly passions would again be aroused. This is the warning to the American people. This is what we're going through right now. And our people would again be polarized in their opinions, and the credibility of our free institutions of government would again be challenged at home and abroad. Is not the ultimate fate of Richard Nixon that most concerns me, though it deeply troubles every decent and compassionate person. My concern is for the immediate future of this great country. As president, my primary concern must always be the greatest good of all the people of the United States whose servant I am. And then he warned that domestic tranquility would be threatened if you go down this path. Quote, my conscience tells me clearly and certainly that I cannot prolong the bad dreams that continue to reopen a chapter that is closed. My conscience tells me that only I, as president, have the constitutional power to firmly shut and seal this book. My conscience tells me it is my duty not merely to proclaim domestic tranquility, but to use every means that I have to ensure it. So here he's warning about the vicious cycle, the one that we are presently in. And because he says, as he stated, it would, quote, go on and on and on. And here we are. You had Russiagate, you had Special Counsel Mueller, you had the two impeachments of Donald Trump. And then you have, then Trump comes out of office. You have the election challenge. You have January 6th. And then what do we have now? Now we have, Trump's got a special counsel over classified documents. And Biden's got two special counsels, one for his handling of classified documents, another for he and his son's business dealings overseas during his time as vice president. Republicans are calling for an impeachment inquiry. And now Jack Smith has brought charges against Trump. And so you have this vicious cycle of prosecutions going back and forth and back and forth. Now you can say Democrats have more power right now, so Republicans have to defend themselves. And, but is this a deterrent is my question. Does this deter, or is this an escalation and might only provoke more and more and more? Even Republicans, as these new indictments were coming down, were saying, oh, it's very convenient as we were bringing, this is like House Oversight Committee, bringing new attention to light about Joe Biden's business dealings, and Hunter Biden's business dealings, which are going to be subject of an impeachment inquiry. They were complaining about they're manipulating the news cycle with indictments. That, our prosecution of Joe Biden is being interfered with by Joe Biden's prosecution of Donald Trump. And it goes on and on and on. So this was Ford's prediction about what would happen under these types of circumstances. I think he was right. Seeing clearly how matters could only escalate in such an environment. at one point saying potential trials, quote, hang like a sword over our former president's head. Now, this is actually a reference to the ancient Sicilian tale. It's like a, I don't know, like a, kind of folk tale of the sword of Damocles. Now, this is popularized by Cicero. He was a lawmaker, senator in Rome, and also philosopher. But the story is wherein Dionysius lets Damocles be king for a day, provided that he sit on a throne underneath a sword dangling by a single hair of a horse's tail, illustrating the fear that Dionysius felt every day for his life and why he had to rule so cruelly in order to maintain the throne. In the end, Damocles begs to be allowed to cede the throne. He doesn't want to sit under a sword and have that fear of constantly losing power. And then what does it lead to is that people will cling to their power. They will act tyrannically in order to maintain that power when there's this cycle of kind of political violence, but political prosecution, using the force of law rather than force of arms, but using the force of law against your political opponents. I think is kind of what, so that I threw that in there because Gerald Ford threw it in there. He said, this is a sword of Damocles, these potential prosecutions. So he, I think, would agree with this. It is now easy to fast forward from the Trump impeachments of 2019 and 2020 to see how Ford's warning of a never-ending cycle is true, with House Republicans firing up their own potential impeachment inquiry against Joe Biden. Would they be doing that if Trump had never been impeached, if there had never been Russiagate, if there had never been special counsel Mueller, and then what's come afterwards with all these new special counsels being appointed? I mean, what is there? There's 3 acting special counsels right now. Again, 2 against Biden, 1 against Trump. There was Durham. So at one, we went from 1 with Durham being appointed to 3 with the classified documents. Then we were down to 2. Now we're back up to 3 special counsels. And so how many special counsels have there been? That's 5. We've had 5 special counsels since 2017 to prosecute ostensibly political crimes. And that's, because that's all Russiagate was. It was Trump utilizing the DNC emails dump that occurred by WikiLeaks and saying, hey, there's some corruption over at the DNC. Hey, look, they were favoring Hillary Clinton in the primary. That's not fair. I thought primaries were supposed to be left up to the people. Something like that. And so they, basically Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee said these emails were hacked and Russia did it and Donald Trump conspired with them. And they passed that information via the Christopher Steele dossier to the FBI and resulted in a counterintelligence investigation, spying, FISA warrants against the Trump campaign, then the Trump transition, then the Trump administration. They carried over a top secret investigation into Donald Trump, into his time in the White House. They had Jeff Sessions recuse himself as Attorney General to make way for a special counsel, which ultimately happened, so that they could remove him from office and ultimately impeach him. It was all quite premeditated in that capacity. It was to incapacitate the Trump presidency from the get-go. And look what a vicious cycle this has set off. I don't think the House Republicans would be looking at impeachment right now if none of that had ever happened. I think that this is tit for tat. And it's going to get worse. Quite honestly, it's going to get worse before it gets better. It might be a good question for, if not, the implication is that the prosecutions, whether in Congress or by the Justice Department, of sitting in former presidents do not necessarily deter, but rather provoke retaliations and escalations as both parties vie for power. This is why the framers ruled out, as Alexander Hamilton did in Federalist number 70. Here's Alexander Hamilton. He wrote Federalist number 70. It was James Madison and Hamilton who wrote the bulk of these. John Jay, I think he only wrote like 3 of them. But these were the arguments in favor of the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution that we have. And so in Federalist number 70, the framers said the Constitutional Convention had decided on a unitary executive. So they ruled against distributing executive power amongst several officials, or the concept of a co-presidency similar to ancient Rome's constitution that provided for 2 consuls to serve to check each other's power out. ultimately because it led to civil wars and the dissolution of the republic and the rise of the emperors, as I mentioned earlier. It's also why the framers made the threshold for conviction in an impeachment so difficult to attain. 2/3 of the Senate must vote to convict a sitting president. You think even if Republicans get their impeachment inquiry, even if they prove their allegations of corruption or bribery or influence peddling beyond a reasonable doubt, you think Democrats are going to vote to remove Joe Biden from office? I mean, since it's never happened before. Now, maybe, but they'll surely, out of a sheer act of self-preservation, they will move forward with it. They feel like they must. That if the Republicans cede the impeachment territory, the special counsel territory, the prosecute the political opponents territory, then we'll just be walked over. We'll be steamrolled. They'll say. Because then they'll be too weak, and then the other party will just dominate them and just throw them all in jail or something like that. That's the argument for going after Biden right now, which is that, we have to ensure mutually assured destruction. But that's what it is. It's mutually assured destruction, and it's a vicious cycle. How do you get out of the vicious cycle? How do you break the vicious cycle? Well, I think you do what Gerald Ford did. I think you issue pardons or something like that. I think you show mercy, which is what he did. He speaks about mercy and, basically golden rule, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. So the question of how do we get out of this? Maybe Gerald Ford, people should read his speech, go back and hit rewind. You can listen to his speech. And maybe it has some answers for how we get out of this mess. Because I think it's just going to get worse. So yeah, you had a supermajority for of the several state senators to remove a president from office, which has never happened, which would include members of the president's own party to remove and disqualify the president. This is also the classic problem of republics, but also other forms of government. And so the entire constitutional structure was in order to cure what James Madison called, quote, the mischiefs of faction. This was Federalist number 10. And he talks about the mischiefs of faction in Federalist number 10. This is my favorite Federalist paper. You know that because I keep citing it, and I think it's very, very timely for today. If you haven't read the Federalist Papers, these are the arguments in favor of the Constitution. I highly recommend them. Just as a matter of educating yourself about what the Constitution means, what did the framers intend. A lot of the arguments that were made at the Constitutional Convention are expounded upon in the Federalist Papers, which is arguably one of the greatest, works of political philosophy in human history. And he writes, Madison in Federalist number 10, quote, the friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice of political violence. Madison also hypothesized that the U.S. Constitution could prevent such recurring reciprocal political strife and civil wars that were well documented to have brought down Republican forms of government in antiquity. So if you go read Thomas Paine, he's saying, yeah, the Constitution will prevent civil wars. And Madison's hypothesizing the same thing about the Constitution that was put together. But it wasn't true. As soon as the framers were gone, as soon as they were all dead, a couple generations later, in 1860, you did have a civil war. The Constitution, the piece of paper alone, could not prevent it. And so if it happened once, it can happen twice, guys. Meaning even under the U.S. Constitution, with due process and other protections of the accused explicitly expounded upon and written in, the wider body politic is always at risk of tearing itself asunder, with factions imprisoning one another being an obvious, predictable cause. In the current case, the essence is in the state of nature. Parties might never agree to a social contract exiting the state of nature if there was not an assurance that standing for election in opposition to an incumbent president, as Trump is doing, or losing an election, as Trump did in 2020, would not be grounds for imprisonment. Trump's running for president again, and they want to disqualify him, so they're going to try to lock him up. If Trump wasn't running for president again, would they have pursued these charges as vigorously as they are being pursued now? Or is it to knock him off the chessboard? It looks that way. I mean, you look at public opinion polls. I think a clear majority of Americans think that this is at least in part politically motivated to go against the political opponent. And of course, if Trump had won in 2020, there would be no indictments. When it comes to prosecuting political opponents, the problem isn't that we aren't doing that enough. It might be that we're already doing it too much. And doing it more might appear to ensure an equal implementation of justice, if we want to call this justice, of these prosecutions. But as has already been seen, it does not appear to act as a deterrent as intended. So, Democrats go against Trump, and they're have special counsels and everything. Ultimately, you get a special counsel appointed in return. Durham's looking at the Democrats and what they did, to kind of conjure up the Russiagate fiasco, and back and forth and back and forth. Impeachments beget more impeachments. Prosecutions beget more prosecution. So instead, it appears to be leading to further escalations. Biden, as of yet, has not issued any pardon, of course, for the former president, and leaving the matters of state to state and federal courts to adjudicate. And ultimately, perhaps the Supreme Court, where Trump's attorneys will ultimately seek redress on First Amendment and other grounds for many of the charges that are being brought against him, and things that Trump had the power to do, like declassify the documents that he's accused of retaining while he was president. He received the documents, he retained the documents, and then when he left office, he still retained the documents. And then there's a process to decide what goes in the archives, what he gets to keep in the library, and so forth. And whatever the Democrats in power, Joe Biden, and the archives and special counsel Jack Smith, Merrick Garland, the attorney general, didn't want to let that civil process play out, and adjudicate which goes in the archives and which goes over here, which goes to the library. They didn't want to adjudicate it that way. They said, we'll make a criminal violation out of something the president otherwise has the power to do, and former presidents otherwise have the power to do, which is to pursue these civil processes. They didn't want to let the civil processes. So we've criminalized our civil processes for the disposition of presidential records that Trump received while he was in office and then retained upon leaving office, which, what was he supposed to do? Just forward everything back, and you got all these boxes or whatever. So they take everything to Mar-a-Lago, and that was the office of the former president. The office of the former president is actually taxpayer funded. And so, where would you bring the documents of the former president? Why? To the office of the former president. And then you ham it out with the archives about what goes where. In any case, we're criminalizing that. We're criminalizing Trump's election challenges that were raised in 2020 and in 2021. Basically just lobbying elected officials, whether they be state legislators, state legislatures, governors, secretaries of state, the vice president, anyone that you or I would have a right to kind of speak out and say, pass this law, or yes, the election was, it was not correct. We need to send it back to the states, as Trump called for. We need to recertify or whatever. That's political speech. We have a right to speak out. When Democrats were challenging the election results, and when a Green Party a nominee for president was Jill Stein, when she was challenging the election results in 2016, she was making many of the same allegations that Trump ended up making in 2020 about voting machines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that wasn't grounds for, locking up Jill Stein. Jill Stein had a right to go to court. She had a right to raise those electoral challenges. When people were trying to overturn the Electoral College and get to, electors for Trump to flip and vote for Hillary Clinton, or just to get the election into the House of Representatives. That's what those are First Amendment protected speech. Did I agree with that speech? No, I thought it would be horrible for the country to overturn the verdict of the American people who had voted for Trump in 2016. But did they have a right to try to lobby in that capacity? Was that a crime to try to say, yes, overturn the Electoral College? No, it wasn't a crime. But under the Jack Smith's reading of law, if there was anything erroneous about the Russiagate allegations, then surely it would be a crime. So that I think where we are right now. Would Jack Smith prosecute the prosecutors in the Justice Department who went after Trump or tried to go after Trump for what turned out to be false allegations of being a foreign agent, of being a Manchurian candidate? Do we truly have equal justice here? And I don't think these are, by the way, I don't think these are good precedents to set. I'm just, noting the fact that it's not going both ways right now, and that's going to lead to more escalation. So no matter how just partisans claim all these prosecutions and investigations are, this is not equal justice under law. It is mutually assured destruction. So I would wonder if when Trump goes to the Supreme Court with this, will the Supreme Court take domestic tranquility into account, as Gerald Ford did, and the vicious cycle that we are in right now? Or would they just want to wipe their hands clean of Trump and say, oh, yeah, just get rid of him? What could possibly go wrong? I say that the American people decide who is the president of the United States. I say the American people will decide who is the president of the United States in 2024, because they're not going to disqualify Trump from running for office. There are no charges of insurrection. Therefore, there'd be no constitutional basis for doing so. And oh, by the way, House Republicans would have to vote to disqualify him. So it's just not going to happen. So you just have all these gratuitous trials going on and on and on in an attempt to probably interfere with the elections, to be politicized, so we're not talking about the issues facing this country. Instead, we're talking about these stupid trials and special counsels and impeachments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's where we are right now. It's what's happened to our country. And we've been there ever since 2016, when the counterintelligence investigation of Trump began by the Obama administration, where Joe Biden was vice president. And it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. How do we end this vicious cycle? Gerald Ford told us how. He said, quote, I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy. He was right, I say. But nobody seems to be listening. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day. But first, we're going to go to the chat, see what you guys are saying. You're probably all telling me I'm wrong. Lock them up, lock them up, lock them up. Right? You want to just lock them up, I bet. Let's see. Here's one. Blaine Carroll, Hillary Clinton and a foreign spy made up the fake Russia collusion story to take down a sitting president. That's called treason. Why hasn't she been charged? All right. There's a call for political prosecution. Beach story. Hillary and the Democratic People's Party questioned President Trump win for 4 years and still are. Jackie Resky, absolutely agree, 100. I don't know if you agree with me or everyone in the chat. So Blaine Carroll, under Biden administration policies against attacking fossil fuels, our grocery prices have doubled, gas prices doubled, insurance premiums skyrocketing, and utilities up 30% 2 years in a row. See, those are very important issues that I would much prefer to be talking about. But, as you noted, you would prefer to prosecute Hillary Clinton for treason. So I don't know if we're going to get to talk about gas prices doubling, inflation, and what's the best monetary policy or the best fiscal policies to get our economy to move in the right direction and to get the inflation under control, because we're wasting all of our time talking about political prosecutions because we can't help ourselves. Anthony Vigil, welcome. Welcome in all. I hope you're having a great day. You too, Anthony. Take care, man. Manuel Verdugo. Okay, so we got, I don't speak Spanish, sorry. Let's see. Terry Lilly from YouTube. Thanks for watching on YouTube. Kathy O'Brien has as much to say about Gerald Ford. Not a good person, says Terry. Pat Lane. Okay, let's see. Okay. Naomi Sonnenstahl. This is a sham. What they're doing to President Trump is demonic. Trump hasn't done anything wrong. The Democrats are guilty. What they are accusing Trump. You see what the Democrats have done and are doing now. Facts, not fake news. Let's see here. Tom Emerson. Democrats have no soul, no ethics, no morals. Let's see. Lisa Newcomer, the DA, the DAs are abusing their authority, and McCarthy should start playing ball and withhold funds. Yeah, you could defund Justice Department. You could defund the special counsels. I don't know that the Democrats in the Senate would want to go along with that, but I guess you could shut down the government over it and talk about it for 3 weeks. Maybe that'll stop it. Shelley Gonzalez, term limits for all of them. The president is term limited. Whether Congress is term limited or not, I think that this will go on and on and on, as Gerald Ford warned. Let's see. Karen Stone, at the end, Biden will be in Gitmo. Here's another call for political prosecution. And Don Herbert calls for age limits, in addition to term limits. Okay. And then finally, we have Judy Smith saying, "Get Joe out now." All right. So, some of you are calling for political scalps. I don't blame you. This is the natural tendency. This is the human nature, the mischiefs of faction, as Madison warned about. They do it to you. You want to do it to them. And in the meantime, we're not going to talk about very many issues facing the American people, whether it's the inflation, whether we're spending too much money, whether it's our foreign policy and our role in Ukraine, whether Ukraine should be in NATO or not, etc., whether we should be at war with Russia or not, as some members of Congress are calling for. There are very serious matters facing our country right now, but we're not going to talk about them. We're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about trials, and you can catch it here on YouTube, on Facebook, on Rumble. This is Robert Romano signing off with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.